Hello everyone, today I want to talk about how Russia is trying to take over 4 regions in eastern Ukraine, while Zelenskyy is making a fuss, calling our country's representative an idiot. The negotiations between the two countries have completely broken down. Meanwhile, some are leaking info to Western media, saying Xi Jinping gave orders during talks with the US and is ready to take a tough stance. American media say China is demanding the US lift the chip ban. Just as there are rumors that the Chinese and US leaders might have a phone call about trade issues, several overseas media outlets have reported that China will take a very tough stance, pushing back against the US's repeated accusations that China has violated the China-US trade agreement. A Wall Street Journal published an article on the 3rd, saying that Chinese President Xi Jinping has already authorized Vice Premier He Lifeng, who is in charge of the negotiations, to show that China will not give in to the US and will maintain a tough position. Before the new round of negotiations resumes, China's plan is to turn the tariff reductions under the China-US-Japan-Asia Agreement into a permanent arrangement, and to demand that the Trump administration lift the export ban on chips and semiconductor equipment to China. According to the Wall Street Journal, during Trump's first term, China's negotiation team was mainly led by the market-oriented pragmatist Liu He. After 2 years of negotiations, the so-called Phase 1 agreement that was finally reached was generally interpreted by outsiders as being favorable to the United States. Within China, this agreement was also seen as a modern version of an unequal treaty. The report said that U.S. Treasury Secretary Bessent recently stated that the Phase 1 agreement from Trump's first term will serve as a reference model for the current follow-up negotiations between the U.S. and China. However, Xi Jinping clearly does not want to repeat the mistakes of those unequal treaties. This time, the task Xi Jinping assigned to He Lifeng is much clearer: do not cater to the United States. According to an advisor to Chinese officials, the agreement reached in May was seen as a victory by Beijing, confirming the value of Xi Jinping's firm stance. The Wall Street Journal's report indicates that Xi Jinping's tough stance may seem unreasonable on the surface, and even carries risks. Some say that certain Chinese government advisors have privately questioned whether it is appropriate to confront the United States head-on. Although China is currently facing even greater economic downward pressure, Xi Jinping believes that compared to the first trade war in 2018, China is now in a stronger position to take a tough stance. Moreover, He Lifeng and Xi Jinping are more aligned in their thinking, both firmly believing that state planning can control the overall situation. The report emphasizes that when the next round of China-US negotiations restarts, He Lifeng is unlikely to be willing to discuss China's economic governance model in depth. He Lifeng's main goal is to turn the U.S. tax reduction commitments in the Geneva 96 agreement into a permanent arrangement. He understands that China is prepared to offer further commitments to purchase some U.S. agricultural products, energy, and manufactured goods as bargaining chips in the negotiations. However, China will also demand that the Trump administration lift export controls on Chinese chip technology, semiconductor equipment, and related items. In addition, the English-language South China Morning Post also quoted analysts on June 2, pointing out that the U.S.'s approach of applying pressure while simultaneously proposing negotiations is a typical Trump negotiation style. However, for a strong country like China, this approach is destined to fail. Trump wants to play hardball, but China is not buying it. Trump's attempts to force China to make concessions will only be in vain. According to the South China Morning Post, although the Trump administration is trying to exert maximum pressure on China with new technology control measures to force China to compromise in negotiations, the Chinese side will not give in to this kind of blackmail strategy. Especially since China controls key mineral supply chains, it has strong countermeasures against the U.S. The report noted that after making baseless accusations that China was not speeding up exports, the U.S. government introduced new technology control measures to put maximum pressure on China. Just a few days ago, Trump was loudly shouting on social media that China had completely violated our agreement. Almost at the same time, there were reports saying that the U.S. has suspended exports of certain jet engine technologies and chip design software to China, which is the latest move in a series of export control measures targeting China's high-tech industry. But on the other hand, White House Council of Economic Advisers Chairman Hassett told U.S. media on June 1 that he expects China and the U.S. to hold talks on tariffs this week. Regarding this U.S. strategy, the South China Morning Post quoted analysts as saying that the U.S.'s approach of applying pressure on one hand while proposing negotiations on the other is a typical Trump negotiation style, and this method is doomed to fail. Gu Aihao, founder of the Chinese research institute Longzhou Economic Information, said that the U.S. trade strategy appears to be chaotic and ineffective. When it comes to China policy, the Trump team is either using poor strategies or has no clear plan at all, and this underestimates China's bargaining power and its determination to walk away from negotiations. It's hard to stop China from continuing to control the global supply of critical minerals, which also gives China leverage to counter the US. China's rare earth magnets account for more than 90% of global production. After the previous South China talks, it was widely expected that China would relax its export restrictions on 7 key minerals. However, up to now, China has not confirmed whether it will lift these rare earth restrictions. According to customs data, in April, China's exports of rare earth permanent magnet materials to the U.S. dropped by 58.5%, down to 246 tons. U.S. Trade Representative Catherine Tai complained that China has not sped up the export of critical minerals, which are essential for advanced electronic technologies. According to analysts, unless the U.S. makes concessions on major issues of concern to China, it is unlikely that China will speed up the approval process for rare earth exports. Professor Xian Chang from the Institute of International Studies at Fudan University said that China playing the rare earth card is clearly a trump card against Trump himself, because it concerns many of America's high-end industrial chains, which are their lifeline. Both sides must reach a consensus on some fundamental issues. The U.S. cannot force China into dialogue through pressure, and even less can it force China to make major unilateral concessions. It can be summed up like this. First, on the eve of the upcoming China-U.S. negotiations, the U.S. played the card of accusing China of breaking its promises, trying to seize the initiative and control the direction of the talks. Second, China did not back down. Various media outlets released signals that China would respond strongly, and these signals didn't come out of nowhere. There must be a reason behind them. What kind of tough stance Xi Jinping will take seems to be the main theme on the Chinese side. Third, China mainly demands that the U.S. turn a $29 billion U.S. tax reduction into a permanent arrangement, and also asks the U.S. to lift the chip ban. It seems that future China-U.S. negotiations won't be smooth or peaceful at all. On another note, let's look at how Ukrainian President Zelenskyy is taking a suicidal approach in challenging Russia. After Ukraine successfully launched a surprise attack on Russia's NOT Air Force base and damaged Russian strategic bombers, no one expected the second round of direct talks on June 2 to end well. Russia and Ukraine held an hour-long negotiation in Istanbul, Turkey, to discuss a peaceful resolution to the Russia-Ukraine conflict. Previously, the Ukrainian side had already submitted a position paper on a ceasefire to Russia, and on that day, the Russian side also released a memorandum on resolving the Ukraine conflict. According to the content of the memorandum released by RIA Novosti, the Russian side proposed a solution covering 3 main points. First, Ukraine must declare itself a neutral country. Second, other countries are prohibited from conducting military activities on Ukrainian territory. And third, there are 2 ceasefire proposals. The first ceasefire proposal requires the Ukrainian armed forces to withdraw from the Russian territories they are occupying. This refers to the 4 republics in eastern Ukraine under Russian control, namely Donetsk, Luhansk, Zaporizhia, and Kherson. The second proposal from the man calls for prohibiting the Ukrainian armed forces from rotating their troops, stopping mobilization, and starting the process of demobilization, banning the military presence of third countries in Ukraine, and halting foreign military aid to Kyiv. The Kyiv authorities would give up sabotage operations against Russia, grant amnesty to political prisoners and release detained civilians, lift Ukraine's wartime status, and hold elections within 80 days after the wartime status is lifted. Since Ukraine still holds parts of the 4 eastern regions, Russia's demand for Ukraine to withdraw from these areas is essentially asking Ukraine to give up even more territory, which is believed to be extremely difficult for Ukraine to accept. An official from the Ukrainian delegation said that since Russia only presented this memorandum on the day of the negotiations, Ukraine needs a week to review the relevant terms, so there was no further discussion. In addition, Ukraine has consistently demanded an unconditional, comprehensive ceasefire of at least 30 days as a prerequisite for any substantive peace talks. However, Russia has repeatedly rejected this idea and warned that such a ceasefire would allow the Ukrainian military to regroup and prepare for new hostilities. The head of the Russian delegation in presidential aid, Medinsky, said at a press conference after the negotiations that Russia proposed a temporary ceasefire in specific areas along the front line for 2 to 3 days, in order to retrieve the bodies of fallen soldiers. Russia intends to return 6,000 bodies. However, Ukrainian President Zelenskyy rejected this proposal for a 2 to 3 day ceasefire, even going so far as to call it idiotic. Zelenskyy said at an online press conference that day, "I think they are idiots. A ceasefire should be for saving lives, not just for collecting bodies. Right now, they don't take the ceasefire seriously at all. For them, it's just a brief pause in the war." Zelenskyy also criticized Medinsky as a low-level official who doesn't even understand technical matters. Zelenskyy also urged the United States to impose even tougher sanctions on Russia to force it to accept Ukraine's demands. To sum up, firstly, Ukraine launched a major attack on Russia's Air Force base before the second round of talks, which clearly shows it had no intention of reaching any agreement with Russia. On top of that, it harshly criticized the Russian negotiators as idiots, which doesn't look like an attitude of wanting to continue negotiations either. Secondly, the conditions Russia put forward for the negotiations were also extremely poor, and they even demanded land in the 4 eastern Ukrainian regions that Russia doesn't control. The positions of both Russia and Ukraine can be described as so far apart that even a huge wave couldn't smooth them out. It looks like this war will be very hard to stop.